Hello, and welcome to Art History of the World, Art History Alive. I'm Sir Hammond West, and today we'll be speaking of the famous painter Vincent van Gogh. Over the course of his career, he painted 13 paintings, all of which were copies. The original was painted in the field, and the copy was done in the privacy and comfort of his own studio. Previous attempts to study these paintings have been rejected because of the distasteful attitude towards copying, seen as forging. The study of these paintings gives us new information into Van Gogh's process, his way and effects the environment had on the art he produced. Today, my colleagues and I will give you guys a glimpse into the life and 3 of the 13 copies in question.
Vincent William van Gogh was born on March 30, 1853 in Zundert, Netherlands. Vincent van Gogh was given the name of his elder brother, who had died at birth a year before Van Gogh was born. He had 2 junior brothers and 3 sisters, and was strongly attached to his brother Theo. Young Van Gogh was brought up in a religious and strict atmosphere. He had a very uncontrollable temper, was highly emotional, and lacked self-confidence. From the age of 7 to 11, he was taught at home by a governess. Then from the age of 11 to 15, he was sent to boarding schools in the Netherlands. From 1873 to 1876, he worked in London and Paris until he was fired for showing resentment to the customers. Van Gogh went to England as a minister's assistant. Then he studied theology at the University of Amsterdam for 1 year, but gave up. He tried to follow his father's profession and became a preacher in Belgium, but was dismissed after a year for undermining the dignity of the priesthood. From March 1886 to February 1888, Van Gogh lived in Paris. There he met the Impressionists Monet, Renoir, Degas, and Seurat. The Impressionists' use of light and color inspired Van Gogh on updating his own palette. During the Paris years, his color scheme became brighter and lighter. His use of complementary colors in proximity produced remarkable decorative effects. He wrote, "I want to use colors that complement each other, that cause each other to shine brilliantly, that complete each other like a man and a woman." Van Gogh also adapted some ideas of pointillism, but developed his own technique with stronger brushstrokes, sharp composition, and his own color scheme using complementary colors. He created about 200 oil paintings during his 2 years in Paris. In February of 1888, Van Gogh moved to Arles with a plan to found an art colony. His friend Paul Gauguin joined in October. Van Gogh presented him several paintings of sunflowers, but their cooperation lasted only for 2 months. Their arguments about art and life were exacerbated by drinking and rivalry for prostitutes. Van Gogh's mental state was alternating between fits of depression and lucidity. At times, his madness led to aggressive actions. In December of 1888, he attacked Paul Gauguin with an open razor, was stopped, but eventually cut part of his ear off and gave it to a prostitute. Paul Gauguin sent a note to his brother Theo and left forever. Theo immediately came to help. Van Gogh was sent to the State Mental Hospital of St. Paul in St. Remy de Provence. There he lived for a year, made some of his best works, Starry Night, Vincent's Bedroom, and several paintings of irises. Van Gogh was released in May of 1890, and his health improved enough to give him energy for the most intensive work marathon. In just 2 months, he painted 90 excellent works. This included portraits of Dr. Gatschet, in landscapes, still lifes, and wheat fields with crows. In a state of depression, he went out into the wheat field and shot himself in the chest on July 27, 1890. Fatally wounded, Van Gogh died 2 days later in the arms of his brother Theo. Van Gogh became friends with Joseph Rollin when he was living in Arles. They lived close to each other. Van Gogh was inspired to paint Joseph by his silent gravity and tenderness, and his strangely pure and touching voice. Painting him was a way he celebrated their friendship. As shown in these paintings, the warm skin tones and vibrant reds, yellows, and greens in Roland's thick beard are a tribute to the friendship Van Gogh feels for the postman. Van Gogh also emphasizes pinks in Roland's cheeks and lights in Roland's eyes, to demonstrate aspects of his personality. The use of color, lighting, and brushstroke shows the honesty and intelligence Van Gogh saw in the postman Roland. At first, the portraits focused naturalistically on Roland's distinct physical features, which Van Gogh described as Socratic. But in the following versions, the portrait becomes grand and abstract. Van Gogh experimented with different colors and backgrounds. The portraits have rarely, if ever, been shown together. They are usually displayed individually in different museums, like in America, Switzerland, and the Netherlands.
And now to experience the Van Gogh experience.
The most extensively studied repetitions of all of Van Gogh's collections would be the oil paintings The Road Menders and Large Plane Trees. The two are landscape paintings which Van Gogh painted out on excursions from his mental hospital in the Netherlands. The paintings depict the repaving of streets under large trees which dominate the composition. In each you can see heaps of sand and workers in the background, as well as houses which face the street being worked on. Each of the compositions boasts Van Gogh's strong brush strokes, a characteristic of most of Van Gogh's later work. The texture of each tree is made up by a flurry of contrasting linear strokes, and the trees are defined by a strong black outline. In order to create depth and keep the canvas from looking flat from these strong outlines, Van Gogh uses atmospheric perspective on each tree as it falls back in the distance. Most importantly, to not only these pieces, but all of Van Gogh's paintings, is the use of color. In The Road Menders, the composition is predominantly green and yellow, while in Large Plane Trees, the composition is predominantly purple and yellow. The first piece we're going to talk about is Large Plane Trees. Of the two repetitions, this was the first. Despite their almost identical and possibly trace similarity of composition, under heavy scrutiny, it is easy to see this as the original. Curators of the Van Gogh Repetitions exhibit got the chance to x-ray the two paintings, and it became very clear that Large Plane Trees, painted in May 1889, was indeed the first. The underpainting reveals furious strokes where Van Gogh was making corrections and adding or leaving out parts of the composition. The almost illegible flurry of brushstrokes also gives us insight on the way Van Gogh works in public under the heavy scrutiny of onlookers. In paintings made in his studio, brushstrokes are deliberate and calculated, while in the field he makes many more corrections and mistakes. Large Plane Trees is also painted on a thick and coarse canvas with a red commercial print. The canvas's undoubtedly hurried look also adds to the assumption that this was the painting he made while he was out in the field observing the landscape. In the painting The Road Menders, we see a much cleaner painting from Van Gogh. The first thing you notice when viewing the two paintings side by side is the smoothness of the canvas in The Road Menders, the second painting. Van Gogh undoubtedly used a professional-grade art canvas for this composition. Under X-ray, curators surveying the piece could not find any sign of an underpainting. This adds evidence to the conclusion that Van Gogh may have traced it from the original piece. Minor changes have also been made. The piles of rubble, rendered as swirls in the first painting, are now large cubes with dark red hatching to show shadow. We also see Van Gogh decide to take out the dark reflection in the lower right of the canvas. Many art historians believe of the two compositions, the first had more power and contrast, creating a more interesting painting, likely from the strong emotion Van Gogh had felt when creating the first painting. In his studio and out of the environment which had inspired him, The Road Menders looks flat, with less use of black and less emphasis on the foreground and the background.
In December of 1888, Van Gogh began a portrait of Madame Roland, the wife of the artist's close friend, postman Joseph Roland. By March 1889, he had completed 4 additional versions. Van Gogh painted 5 images of Madame Roland as La Berceuse because he wanted to ensure the availability of his best work to all who might want it. Conceiving the painting as part of a triptych to send to Gauguin after they separated, Van Gogh intended La Berceuse to be flanked by 2 paintings of sunflowers. Van Gogh's reference to the painting as La Verreuse goes beyond Madame Roulin's literal action of rocking a cradle. Similar to many subjects he portrayed, such as the poet's garden and sunflowers, the image of a cradle being rocked also held strong symbolic value of nurture and support. Van Gogh felt that this consoling image of a mother would be perfectly suited for the fishermen's sleeping quarters, in which they would literally feel themselves inside the cradle she rocks, lulled to sleep by the swaying motion of the boat. La Verreuse, coupled with Van Gogh's aim to make art that offers consolation for the broken-hearted, reveals an artist engaged in a cathartic process of creating an art that heals. Considering that Van Gogh painted 5 versions of La Verreuse during a time when he needed to be soothed, this image must have offered him great comfort after Gauguin had deserted him. Vincent van Gogh's time in Arles, France was a pivotal point in his life. After years of study and struggle, Vincent moved to the south in an attempt to further explore his art. Many of Van Gogh's most renowned works originated in Arles, and yet at this period in which Vincent was at his most productive, he was alone. Called frou-frou by many of the townspeople of Arles, Vincent was often viewed with suspicion and scorn. A number of Vincent's letters to his brother Theo reflect his isolation and his loneliness. And yet one family welcomed Vincent and encouraged his work. In many respects, the Roulin family were Vincent's only friends in Arles, always challenged to find willing subjects for his portraits. Vincent found the Roulins to be extremely accommodating and patient. In total, Van Gogh painted or sketched 25 works of the Roulin family. Thanks to the old postman, Joseph Roulin, and his family, to their kindness toward this eccentric and troubled painter, Vincent was able to produce some of his best-loved works.
Thank you for joining us to discuss the many duplicates of Van Gogh. Next time on Art History of the World, Art History Alive, we'll be discussing the Sphinx in Egypt and its many states.